Okay, so I'm going to get right to it. It is 12 o'clock noon Eastern time. We only have 30 minutes here, which is going to go by pretty quickly. And the intention of this roundtable is the management and execution of virtual events. And I want to preface that I'm not here to necessarily tell anybody how to change their role in the industry or what they're doing is incorrect or wrong. This is really to come from a positioning from my experiences, the projects that I've been working through, and also coming from a positioning that goes beyond the logistics. So welcome everybody. My name is Nicole McNabb. I am the founder of Emenee Marketing and Events. And as you want to join by camera if you choose, and you can request to unmute. We want this to be a conversation. And if you would, just let us know in the chat where you're coming from and also your positioning in the industry. So with that said, I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to kind of do a presentation, have some conversations. So the more engaging that we are, go ahead and join the chat. If you would like to join here on stage, I am more than happy to invite you to the roundtable. So with that said, I'm going to dive in. All right, and so if you all see my screen here. All right, so again, I'm going to kind of go back and forth. The framework that we're talking about today is what I call the management and execution beyond the logistics. And what do I really mean by that is when we think about events, a lot of times people think all about the logistics, right? Who needs to be where and when, what needs to be where, how does it get there? And now, what does that look like in a virtual world? And so there are many, many different workshops or roundtables that really dive deep into those logistics, which we will touch on. But the intention of this workshop and this roundtable is really to discuss what goes beyond those logistics and how do we get there and what are some of the differentiators in the virtual space. And so this is my framework that I work with for all events. And the difference is, even though the framework is the same, the execution of each event is what makes every event unique. Okay, so I'll give a high level and then let's dive into each one and let's talk about them. So the objective number one of framework is to find our event clarity. This sounds like event planning 101. So depending on each of you and your experience, maybe your role in the industry, go ahead and leave us in the chat. Let us know kind of your positioning. And number one is to get that event clarity. We're going to dive into really the main questions that I go through during this framework. Number two, before we even step into those logistics and the execution, is what I call to develop an effective customer journey. And I dive at a very high level how I do this, and I do it really coming from that marketing and experience, but also what happens before, during, and after, but also understanding who the stakeholders are of the event. So if you're coming in as the organizer and as the host, it's our responsibility to consider that customer journey for our attendees, but also what about our speakers and our sponsors, our exhibitors, our facilitators, our supporting vendors and other event professionals? What is the customer journey? Now, if you're coming in as a partner, as a sponsor, or as a presenter, we still have a customer journey, a part of that event, but that customer journey, what we're doing before, during, and after, is a lot different than our responsibilities as a host before, during, and after. So by mapping out and really thinking and going into how to create that customer journey and what does that look like in a virtual space and how does it different from and in person, and what sort of questions. So we're going to dive at a very high level again on this, just given our time frame and having a discussion. We're looking at this really at a high level. And then I do have additional resources or videos. I'm going to be doing another follow-up to each of these. So again, this intention is to go through the framework at a very high level. Number 3, when we're talking about a framework for managing and executing an event, we want to consider how are we monetizing the event platforms, sponsors, tactics, and is monetization, is that something a part of the event? Now, typically I'm working in the B2B space, and there is some level of monetization or cash flow or intention to raise those funds. And so that's not always the case. And you're going to determine that in that event clarity and in that customer journey, depending what those objectives are and how we're ranking them. And then number 4 is really where the execution begins. And I call what we've created the prioritize to optimize the 6 foundations. And so I'm going to dive in what those 6 foundations are. Okay, so I'm going to exit out before diving in to each of these, and just let's see, how are we doing with the chat? Let's pop in here. And if anybody would like to join by camera or the roundtable, so let's talk about some of these, just so I know which direction to continue this roundtable and this discussion. These are the 4 pillars of the framework. And the reason why I call it a framework is I actually used to call it a blueprint. And when you think about a blueprint, right, if you're an architect and once you have your blueprint, you don't want to change anything in a blueprint, because if you do, that foundation could crumble, whether it's a bridge or a house, whatever it is that that blueprint is creating. Once you have that blueprint, you do not want to change from that blueprint. The reason why I call it a framework is exactly because if you have a picture frame and you have that frame, what you put into that framework can be altered, right? That is what makes the framework something that you can change depending on your event. And so this is intended to be a guidance, and it's also how I go about each event, and then how can we take this framework in this world of virtual. Are most interest to you? Okay, 1 and 2, interested in number 3, great. Okay, wonderful, wonderful, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to dive into each one of these so that you can get a sense. I have the slide deck as well. Also, I am on LinkedIn. Michelle Nicole McNabb, would love to connect with each of you. How many of you are on LinkedIn? If you leverage LinkedIn as a platform, let me know. I also have Georgia here, and Georgia and I, we are going to connect with anyone that is also on LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook and YouTube as well. Those are some platforms. And I bring this up because given our time frame, we'll go into it, let's discuss it, let's continue that conversation. So thinking of the customer journey, let's go through, and then afterwards, continue the conversation. If there are pieces that you want to dive a bit more into, any resources, checklists, beyond checklists, let us know. Yay! Hi, Larry. I see Larry is in here. Larry, I just checked out your session. If any of you are looking about monetizing and sponsorship, Larry Wheel is actually in the audience right now. Make sure you connect with him. He actually just did a great session on exactly this, on the sponsorship side. All right. All right. So diving in, the event clarity. Now, let me show you here. This is Asana. I use a project management system. It works for me. We are all different. Again, I am not coming in with the intention to tell you how to plan events necessarily, but this is how I deliver that framework. And so here, these are the common questions, and these are going to look very familiar. How many of you are already planning events? Let us know kind of your positioning, where these absolutely play a part when it comes to virtual events, but it's the very first part. So we want to, again, understand what is their role. Are they the organizer or are they a partner? Are they a speaker? Are they a sponsor? Now, my positioning also really does like working with those sponsors and those exhibitors because there are a lot of resources for organizers. And there are amazing event planners and a lot of production teams that are already serving the organizer. And yet the huge gap in the industry are, what about those sponsors and what about those exhibitors and what is their customer journey and what do they need, and their objectives are going to be different. So first and foremost, absolutely understanding the role of the positioning, whether you are the planner or you are the host, and sometimes you're one and the same. Obviously, is there a date set yet? Now, depending on the type of virtual event, I'm going to kind of hone in as much as we miss the in-person to really frame this roundtable on the virtual and the hybrid. And the date set, this is also very interesting, and I would love to hear your feedback of what you guys are experiencing. When I am working with conferences and multi-day events, I really like to have at least 100-day minimum. Now, we've done conferences in less than 100 days, but I kind of like that framework because it helps to manage expectations, which I dive into a little deeper, right? Whereas if we're doing a summit and maybe the intention is to build your audience and build that email list and to have a roundtable discussion, or maybe it's a webinar, absolutely that date can be a bit closer. So understanding when is the date, what are the expectations, that dives exactly into that next framework. Have you done this type of event before? When and how many? And so what's happening is, even in, let's say, the conference space, or we have this abundance of organizers that have a really great understanding of how their event looks on ground, right? Who else is experiencing that? Where we've been doing this event for 5 years, 17 years, maybe it's an association, or they've done it on ground and they know exactly how to run end to end, A to Z on ground. And now they're coming to say, but how do we convert that, right? So it's good to know when you're talking, whether to the clients or to your team, have we done this event before? When and how many times? And what does that look like? Because if that is still unclear, again, this is part of the clarity, then we want to really hone in on what does that agenda look like? What is our run of show before we can start to execute, right? This is the management side, and I'm figuring out what type of event are we talking about? Is it a multi-day event? And are there 125 speakers or are there 11 speakers? Is it a 2-hour event like today? Or do we have to fly down to Nashville and do a 4-day multi-track conference where 45 speakers are talking at the same time? So these sort of clarities, because very similar to in person, these are the type of questions that we want to know before we can even start sourcing different platforms. And Larry, I know that you're on here. You and I both, we have done a lot of research and a lot of demos and working with different event technology teams of the different platforms. All right, going into the next one, of course, that segues into, well, what are the objectives? This is one of the very key things when talking the virtual events and the framework, because so many times and in these communities, I'm seeing, what platform should we use? Well, again, by answering some of these framework questions, now we can dive into understanding how to narrow down all the many platforms, VII being one of them. A great example, I was just on a project, is how I was introduced to VII, and we actually combined 4 different platforms into a customized experience based on the objectives of, we needed something that could withhold multi-track up to sometimes 15 different breakouts at the same time, with the bandwidth, with the experience of the VII experience, yet having the event management side on the back end, right? So understanding those objectives and what does that look like? I actually have a whole segment of what I call the 7 C's of event ROI. And I break down whether it be cash flow, is it customer journey, community connection, what does that look like? The target audience, I feel like, again, this is event 101, target audience, have a clear audience. Who is it that we're looking for? But again, depending on your role, if you're a speaker, sponsor, who is it that you're looking to connect with? What does your team look like, especially in the virtual world? Right? So again, understanding what the event and the intention of that event, and now to put your team together, which we dive a bit more into. Because is it an internal team? Your volunteers that have been doing your on-site event for the past 5 years is a much different ask than to learn a platform and to be a facilitator and or volunteer on a new platform. And a great example of this, for instance, we have Georgia, she's a part of our team, and she is also part of our, what we call our speaker concierge team. And your speaker concierge team on ground may look a little like this, where you make sure that your speakers are where they need to be, that their presentations are ready to go, that they have all their bios and all the things ready to go. In a virtual space, what does that look like? And the trainings, and to make sure that the equipment, that you have the right microphone, that you're testing on the right network, right? And to have a speaker concierge team that's familiar with the tech side, but also the speakers, to make sure that everything is ready to go. And so who is it that we need in the virtual space? There is a bit more of that learning curve and a bit more of that understanding of the tech side, plus the understanding of the event itself. And so asking whether it's you as the organizer or your client, how many do we need? Now, what we have found is with our speaker concierge team, once they are up and trained, my speaker concierge team can manage about 4 breakout rooms at any given time. Anything more than that, and that's with a lot of training and understanding, right? And so if you have, let's say, 20 breakout rooms going on at the same time, that's going to change what your team looks like in a virtual world, which may be a lot different than what is needed versus registration. In person, a lot of times you need a lot of people on deck so that you can keep registration in person going and get your tickets, getting your badges, and it's smooth, where you may need less people in the virtual space, right? Because it's automated. And once it's in, now you might need somebody at a help desk, but again, that help desk in the virtual space is someone that has a bit more understanding on the tech side. What would you consider? Whoops, I went down too fast. How would you consider this event a success? You're asking these same questions. How do you track metrics? I absolutely love the virtual events for the metrics. VII has some amazing back-end analytics that you're gathering. This is very important for sponsors. They want to know the data, and we have that at our fingertips. So how are we tracking that, and what is important? Again, what is the call to action before, during, and after, and how can we deliver that in a virtual space? So these are, again, I wanted to dive a bit deeper, just that was a big question here, was the event clarity, okay? So is there anybody that, how are you addressing these questions or seeing these are different in the virtual space? Because I do want to hit some of these very high level. The other big thing is that tech, where when sourcing your venue in person used to be what city, what location, and how are people getting there, and what sort of room blocks do we need, where in the virtual space, you still need to ask these questions of the clarity, yet now it's more so where are we calling in from? Is it going to be a hybrid event, as in we have a main stage and we have someone being broadcasted to everybody? Or is this something like today where everybody's actually calling in differently? And we want to make sure that each of those speakers have high internet and all the right equipment, and that they can access the platforms, and that they're able to make it as easy as possible. Exactly. Yes, there could be a whole nother roundtable and presentation just on the training component. Absolutely. And each platform is very unique and different. Pretty extensive planning. Absolutely. Yes. And I feel that that's something too, where again, we've been doing this event for years and years and years. And what I'm hearing from my clients and from my projects is they don't know what they don't know. And that is the biggest thing right now. And as event professionals, to stay on top of those trends, network and connect and help one another through what are we finding, and helping them so that we can anticipate and what is it that they need to be trained on, right? So I'm going to move to the next component, which is the event customer journey. Now, we do not have time to go through all of these, but I want to at least address, because I share this in a way that you don't need necessarily a marketing background degree, but again, talking about management and execution beyond the logistics. At a very high level, those 6 foundations are strategy, which we really did a very high level, the clarity. Strategy, your logistics, your event outreach, the nurturing, the sales, and the metrics. So I'm going to dive into each of those and what's included in each of them. But with that customer journey, really before, during, and after, how are we attracting, converting, our deliver, and our close? And I gotta ask, I normally play this song, who knows the rock band AC/DC? And I know this is an international event right now, so I'm very curious of the demographic. Who knows AC/DC and their song TNT? The reason why I share this way is, as event professionals, or as the director of events, or perhaps I work a lot of times with associations or sales teams, and they don't want a crash course on marketing necessarily. They just need to know how to get it done, right? And so again, now that we've clarified who those stakeholders are and who that target audience is, now we can start asking, how are we going to attract? What are we converting to have that conversation and continue that conversation before the event, during the event, after the event? Great example. Right now, I've shared that I'm on LinkedIn, would love to continue the conversation. So we're attracting, converting to continue the conversation. What is the deliverable? And far too often do we go from we're attracting to asking people to come to our event. That works with a warm market. That works when they already know who you are. But what are the steps that we need to take, which is not something that we're going necessarily into on today's call, but I have this breakdown, kind of what are those steps, right? So how do we attract, convert? What is it that we want to deliver? So if we're thinking about our sponsors, again, Larry is on here. What is that deliverable? And so how are we attracting those sponsors versus what are we able to deliver? And when we deliver, how are we going to activate that? And what happens when we close? And what is that onboarding? What does that look like? What is the communication? What is happening? And how we do that is through traffic, the nurturing. And this is also where the communication, what does that look like? And how in the virtual space, I'm very interested in hearing like, what is working? People are so zoomed out, right? And they're so bombarded with emails and text messages. And so really to have those touch points, are they the event in the box? How are you nurturing that audience, your sponsors and your speakers? Are you sending a speaker gift? And then how are you tracking what's working and what's not working and what is important? All right, let's see. We have some comments. Great. We have some discussions going. Are exactly an extension of a digital marketing. Absolutely. Yes. I love that. I love that, Daniel. Yes. I'm reading through exactly. It's a much different mindset. Yes. New metric can be on the website traffic, spikes against traditional measurement. Absolutely. Or you think that the virtual event with 3D were okay, great question about the 3D and VR. This is very interesting. I recently did an event, actually partnered with VII, where we had a 2D. We opted for the 2D rather than the 3D. Again, going into the objectives and the type of event and the objections of why the board really did not want a 3D because of that learning curve, right? Sometimes, so definitely understanding that audience and the objectives of your event can really help. And definitely I would reach out to VII or someone like myself or someone that is working with the different platforms where when we had that multi-day, it was a long event, it was a conference, and it was just content that had to be shared for the association purposes. Adding another layer that people had to like maneuver just it was too much. It was too much. And so we did do a 2D that it was more of a click and go experience. And that really did help the user experience without an overabundance of a learning curve, right? Okay, so the Monetize the Event platforms and sponsorship, I'm actually going to not dive too much into this one here. I can share again, at a very high level, and I'm more than happy to share this checklist with any of you that connects with me afterwards, absolutely. So just at a high level, kind of the talking points, again, we want to look at the stakeholder ecosystem. We want to align those goals. So now that you're clear of your goals of the event, to align that with those other stakeholders. How are we justifying that ROI? Managing expectations, communications, compliance, and activation. And this is also an area touching on the virtual events absolutely come into play. I could do a whole nother discussion just on compliance alone. Larry and I, we've had a couple conversations on this as well, keeping in mind because we are bringing in that data and the marketing component, okay? Now, the last part being the 6 foundations. Again, I have this slide deck here, and we're just talking through the framework, and now how can we convert that, because we don't necessarily want to take exactly what's on ground into the virtual space, right? And so the framework being what goes beyond these logistics. And to give a good example, and I know we only have a minute or two here, for each segment, there's different touch points, right? And for instance, under logistics, as we think an event of logistics going through, well, logistics is actually broken down into 5 categories: the communication, the event planning checklist, the marketing and communication, the staffing, and then the business management, right? And with logistics, every checklist has a checklist. If you've ever put on an event, every checklist has a checklist, right? And so the intention is to understand all these components at a high level. I do more trainings on these and dive more into what is it as event professionals beyond the logistics are we diving into the event strategy, which we really spent a lot of time today diving in. What are we looking for? Once we have that event strategy, then we can start to execute on these logistics, because that's going to help our framework. Then once we have that understanding and we have that customer journey, now we can start to consider what tactics are we going to outreach and nurture. And based on those platforms and based on those objectives, we can tie in those metrics. So those are really the framework. Any one of you, I know that we have some other roundtables, and there's other people jumping in as well. So I want to respect everyone's time. We're going to definitely download the chat. Would love to hear some feedback, kind of what your takeaways are, some of your greatest takeaways, and also if you are on LinkedIn, if you would like to continue the conversation or have any of these checklists or dive into this a bit deeper, I would love to hear kind of that feedback. If this is a good framework, what to start considering, where to expand skill sets beyond the logistics.